She wasn't supposed to be out here alone. For 12 straight days, her 16 goats had walked to the exact same spot on the steep eastern hillside and refused to take another step. They weren't grazing on the lush leaves. They weren't frightened by predators. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder in a silent, dense line, staring into a massive wall of tangled kudzu, as though something hidden deep beyond the vines was telling them to stay back. Determined to find out why, she gripped the smooth hickory handle of her machete and hacked through another curtain of tangled green ropes. One more heavy swing, then she froze. What she found hidden beyond that wall of green would explain why 45 forgotten acres sold for just $5 hid something nobody expected. As you watch, see if you can figure out what the goats noticed before she did, because the answer changed everything that followed. 3 months earlier, those 45 acres had become the piece of land nobody in Calloway County wanted. For nearly a decade, invasive kudzu had swallowed everything in its path, hiding rocky hills beneath thick green vines, erasing old barbed wire fence lines, and concealing limestone sinkholes that made every single step across the property uncertain. The county officials had grown tired of maintaining the overgrown perimeter, tired of chasing unpaid property taxes, and tired of listening to neighboring landowners complain as the destructive vines crept farther into their pastures each year. When the property finally went to the county tax auction, the opening bid wasn't meant to attract competitive buyers. It was simply the county's desperate way of making a permanent problem disappear. At just $5, the land wasn't being offered as an opportunity, but abandoned as a heavy burden after 2 previous owners had already tried and failed to reclaim it. Both arrived with large bulldozers, heavy excavators, and every mechanical advantage money could buy. Yet both eventually walked away with damaged machinery, broken steel treads, and 45 acres that looked almost untouched by their efforts. Before long, people around town stopped calling it farmland and simply referred to the ridge as impossible. Yet one question refused to leave Clara Vance's mind. If the land had truly been worthless, why had people once invested so much labor in owning it before letting it disappear beneath years of total neglect? The old property records mentioned valuable pasture land decades earlier, but nothing explained how it had vanished entirely beneath the kudzu, and the mystery only made her more determined to uncover the truth. Rather than trying to overpower the land with loud engines, she decided to outthink it by using 16 goats instead of heavy machinery. The plan was simple, but it came with one serious problem. She had just 1 week before the borrowed goat trailer had to be returned to its owner, and without those animals, her entire plan would end before it had even begun. She had no way of knowing that the answer she was searching for was hidden in the only place her goats would refuse to enter. She arrived at the ridge with 16 goats, a rusted trailer full of portable electric fencing, 2 water tanks, and a plan that almost everyone believed was doomed from the beginning. There were no heavy bulldozers, no excavators, and no crew waiting to help her clear the brush. If this land was ever going to be reclaimed, it would happen one small section at a time, with 16 hungry goats doing the work that heavy machinery never could. Silas Crawford, who owned the largest industrial cattle operation on the opposite ridge, was idling his truck right at the gravel exit of the driveway. He lowered his window, spat tobacco juice into the gray mud, and looked down at her with an open sneer. He told her that if 300 horsepower steel blades were broken by that ridge, her animals would only end up as meat for the copperheads. Clara did not turn her head to meet his gaze. She simply gave a single slow nod. The earth requires time, not noise. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's begin. The first week unfolded exactly the way the skeptics in Calloway County expected. Local drivers slowed their heavy pickup trucks just to watch the goats disappear into the dense, vertical walls of green kudzu, while Clara hauled water across steep rocky hillsides, carried portable netting from one grazing section to the next, and spent hours cutting narrow paths through the brush simply to reach the animals. The small weathered cabin, sitting on the highest crest of the ridge, welcomed her with the scent of damp pine wood and the sight of dust motes dancing in the faint beams of sunlight that pierced the rusted holes in the tin roof. She did not spend her few remaining hours of daylight sweeping the floor or repairing the broken glass in the western window. Instead, she chose to focus entirely on the boundary lines. Her hands grew rough, the skin splitting along the knuckles from the constant friction of barbed wire and cedar posts. But she did not complain. She worked in absolute silence, systemizing her movements, checking the integrity of every fence post before concluding her day's labor. Inside the cabin, tucked away in an old iron lockbox beneath a floorboard near the hearth, Clara discovered her ancestral guide. It was a heavy ledger-style notebook bound in worn, grease-stained leather that belonged to her grandfather decades earlier. The pages were thick and yellowed, smelling faintly of wood smoke and linseed oil. Written in faded blue ink, the handwritten entries did not detail corporate profits or modern agricultural chemical formulas. Instead, they contained a meticulously recorded history of the soil, weather patterns, and observations on how nature reclaims what man abandons. On the 12th page, a particular sentence stood out in her grandfather's bold script. He wrote that the land remembers every footstep, and that what the modern world writes off as worthless brush is often a protective shield hiding something of immense value. If a person only has the patience to read the landscape correctly. He advised never to force a stubborn ridge with iron, but to watch how the animals move, for their instincts are sharper than any surveyor's tools. This ancestral ledger changed the way Clara viewed her daily struggle. She began to understand that she was not fighting the land, but participating in a slow conversation with it. She paid close attention to the 16 goats, observing how they systematically stripped the broad kudzu leaves, gnawed on the woody vines, and trampled the dense undergrowth into a thick mat of organic mulch. A deep, unspoken bond began to form between the solitary woman and her herd. She avoided treating them as mere tools or naming them carelessly, maintaining a strict sense of reality about the farm. However, she made an exception for the lead male, a large animal with an unusually broad forehead and heavy gray horns that curled tightly behind his ears. She named him Anchor because of his grounding presence. Whenever the mountain winds howled through the ridge at night, Anchor would stand perfectly still at the center of the enclosure, facing the storm while the rest of the herd clustered safely behind his bulk. Every evening, Clara stood by the edge of the newly cleared boundary, watching the goats work until the sun dipped below the distant pine ridges. The progress was not fast enough to impress the neighbors who passed by on the paved highway, but it was steady, observable, and deeply deliberate. Small patches of bare earth began to appear where sunlight had not touched the ground in over a decade. Weathered oak fence posts slowly emerged from beneath the suffocating green canopy, followed by sections of old stone retaining walls that nobody in the county realized were still standing. The goats were slowly uncovering the skeleton of the ridge, stripping away the invasive green blanket hour by hour. Clara would walk among them in the twilight, checking their hooves for injuries and monitoring their water consumption, her silent presence mirroring the quiet determination of the animals. They were two distinct forces working toward a single, unexpressed purpose, moving forward 1 foot of cleared ground at a time. By the middle of November, the mild autumn afternoons vanished entirely, replaced by a bitter, biting cold that rolled out of the northern hills and settled deep into the crevices of the ridge. The winter routine became a test of absolute endurance, requiring Clara to wake at 5:45 each morning, when the air was still dark and heavy with frost. The small creek flowing at the bottom of the ridge began to freeze over, forcing her to carry a heavy iron-splitting maul just to break the thick crust of ice before she could fill her water buckets. Her work boots, once sturdy and clean, were now permanently caked in dark gray mud, and the skin across her knuckles cracked from the constant exposure to the freezing wind. She wrapped her hands in rough gray duct tape each morning to protect the open cuts, refusing to slow down her pace or alter her daily routine. Every 3 days, she moved the heavy rolls of portable electric netting to a new section of the hillside, forcing her body to carry the fiberglass posts up steep slopes that had become slick with frozen mud and decomposing leaves. The progress she made was not dramatic enough to draw attention from the county paper, but it was undeniable to anyone who took the time to look closely. Small patches of bare earth grew wider each week, exposing old limestone boulders and the deep, rich clay soil that had been trapped beneath the kudzu for over a decade. Yet, as the winter deepened, the financial strain began to test her resolve. The price of supplemental grain feed at the local co-op rose by 12% due to a seasonal shortage, and her meager savings began to dwindle far faster than she had originally calculated. In the evenings, when she drove her old Ford F-150 into the small town to buy fuel, she could hear the quiet murmurs from the older farmers gathered around the wood stove at the supply store. They spoke openly about the impossible nature of the ridge, trading small wagers on exactly which week the solitary woman would abandon the land and return to the city. Clara listened to their talk, the way she listened to the winter wind rattling the tin roof of her cabin. She observed the noise, recorded the facts, but never allowed it to alter her direction. Sometime during the middle of December, the owner of the borrowed goat trailer arrived at the ridge to reclaim his equipment. He was an older, quiet farmer named Thomas who had spent his entire life working the rocky soils of Calloway County, and he climbed out of his truck expecting to find an abandoned project and a defeated woman. Instead, he stood in absolute silence for several minutes, his eyes drifting across the cleared eastern slope where the goats had systematically stripped away years of dense growth. The landscape had changed completely, where a chaotic wall of green had once choked the hill. The neat lines of old stone walls and clean earth were now visible in the pale winter light. Thomas turned toward Clara, looked at her taped hands and the quiet determination in her eyes, and let out a slow breath. He told her that he had lived in the county for 60 years and had never seen any machine or crew make that much structural progress against the Kudzu. He unhitched the trailer, climbed back into his truck, and told her to keep the equipment for another 3 months, without charging her a single dime. That simple act of human generosity provided the psychological fuel Clara needed to survive the darkest weeks of the winter. She redoubled her efforts, working alongside the 16 goats as the snow began to fall in light, powdery dustings across the ridge. The animals adapted perfectly to the harsh conditions, their thick winter coats protecting them from the frost, while Anchor continued to lead them into the dense brush, with unwavering discipline. Clara systemized every movement, tracking the daily square footage cleared by the herd and recording the data in the margins of her grandfather's ledger. She noticed that the goats were not just eating the leaves. Their sharp hooves were constantly scarifying the soil, breaking up the hard-packed clay and stamping the organic matter deep into the ground. It was a slow, invisible process of restoration that no bulldozer could ever replicate. A quiet partnership between human intent and animal instinct that was slowly rewriting the history of an impossible piece of land. By the final week of February, the bitter cold began to ease, replacing the frozen crust of the earth with a soft, yielding mud that signaled the coming of spring. It was during these days that the herd's behavior shifted completely, leading Clara directly to the mystery that had begun the entire journey. For 12 consecutive days, the 16 goats walked to the exact same spot on the steep eastern hillside and refused to take another step forward. They stood shoulder to shoulder in a silent, dense line, their ears perked forward, staring intently into a massive wall of tangled kudzu, as though an invisible wall blocked their path. Anchor stood at the front, his head lowered, and his heavy horns slightly tilted, refusing to lead the herd into the dense thicket despite the fresh, green shoots beginning to emerge from the vines. Clara stood behind them, observing their total stillness. She knew their instincts were never random. The animals were sensing a boundary that she could not yet see. Gripping the smooth hickory handle of her machete, she stepped past Anchor and began to swing the heavy blade with deliberate, measured force. She hacked through the first thick curtain of tangled green ropes, clearing away years of accumulated vines that felt as tough as braided wire. One more heavy swing split the canopy completely, and as the curtain fell away, Clara froze in absolute astonishment. Tucked deep into a natural bowl within the hillside, completely hidden from the road and any modern survey map, stood an ancient grove of heritage sugar maples. There were 11 trees in total, their massive trunks measuring nearly 4 feet across, their bark thick and dark with age. These trees had been growing here for over a century, surviving the neglect, the elements, and the suffocating reach of the kudzu, because the natural limestone bowl had protected their roots from the worst of the invasive growth. As she stepped into the quiet shade of the hidden grove, her boots struck something solid buried beneath the moss and decomposing leaves. She knelt down, using her gloved hands to clear away the dark soil, and uncovered a neat row of hand-carved limestone survey markers. They were old cornerstones, set deep into the earth decades earlier, bearing the original surveyor's initials that matched the records in her grandfather's ledger. Clara sat back on her heels, drawing a slow, steady breath as the pieces of the puzzle suddenly locked into place. This wasn't just a forgotten grove of valuable trees. This specific location marked the true historic boundary line of the 45 acres. And it sat nearly 80 feet farther east than the modern fence line Silas Crawford had established for his industrial cattle operation. The discovery changed everything. By forcing the boundary line westward over the years, Crawford had not only claimed a significant portion of the ridge's flat grazing land, but he had also systematically cut off access to the very grove that made the property structurally valuable. He had counted on the Kudzu remaining an impenetrable barrier forever, hiding his illegal encroachment beneath a sea of chaotic green vines. Clara walked along the line of limestone, measuring the distance with a steady rhythmic stride, recording the precise coordinates in her ledger, just as her grandfather had taught her to document every material fact of the land. The impossible ridge was no longer an abandoned waste. It was a documented piece of history, and the truth was now firmly on her side. The true value of the ridge was not confirmed by court papers, but by the slow, measured footsteps of an elderly forestry specialist who had spent 40 years identifying lost heirloom trees across the state. He walked between the massive trunks of the heritage sugar maples, without saying very much, examining the rough bark, measuring the distance between the rows, and making brief notes in a small leather pocket notebook. The longer he explored the hidden grove, the quieter he became, and his silence made Clara wonder whether he was seeing failure or something else entirely. Eventually, he reached up, sliced a small section of the wood tissue with his pocket knife, and watched the dense, rich sap begin to gather. He removed his glasses, looked across the limestone bowl, and said quietly that he didn't think these pure, unhybridized sugar maples existed anywhere else in the region. The invasive kudzu, he explained, hadn't killed the grove at all. By swallowing the hillside, it had hidden the trees from view and protected them from logging, commercial development, and decades of human interference. The county hadn't sold an impossible wasteland for $5. They had sold a priceless historic sanctuary because the grove had vanished from public memory long before it disappeared beneath the vines. The following afternoon, as the setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the newly cleared hillside, the glossy Ram 3500 truck belonging to Silas Crawford pulled up along the gravel edge of the road. The older man climbed out of his vehicle, walked slowly to the edge of the new wire fence, and stood quietly watching the 16 goats clear the remaining vines near the base of the maples. He stayed there for several minutes, his eyes drifting across the rows of ancient trees that had survived in absolute silence while the world around them moved on. Finally, he turned toward Clara, slowly removed his black cowboy hat, and looked down at the ground. He admitted that he had spent his entire life trying to conquer the land with bigger machines, believing the ridge itself was the problem, while she had approached it with patience, allowing the animals to guide her attention instead of forcing the landscape to obey a loud plan. He offered her the free use of his heavy trailers for the spring harvest, an honest gesture of respect delivered without any of his former pride. That night, inside the cabin, Clara * flipped open her grandfather's ledger and wrote a single line beneath the old map. What the world writes off as * a barren wasteland is often just nature's way of guarding its most resilient treasures until someone patient enough arrives to read the soil. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found. Every comment gets read. Everyone.